Welcome to the Smart Connector, the podcast that helps entrepreneurs be the leader their ideal people love. Build your influence, wealth and success, attract others for all the right reasons, and become a smart connector, the architect of your amazing business and life. This is an interview with business psychologist Lindsey Sharratt, who's founder of the A Game, which helps successful people at the top of their field break down barriers that stand between them and their goals. Lindsay's methods are fast, effective and science-based, as her findings and solutions are drawn from her research PhD. We had such an interesting conversation which dipped into the differences corporate high flyers and entrepreneurs face in their quest for success. I'm sure you'll enjoy this interview between us. Hello, Lindsay. It's great to have you here with us.
Hello, Jane. Good to be here.
So, Lindsay, you're an expert in identity. And because this is a podcast about entrepreneurship, I guess the first question that I have for you is, why should entrepreneurs care about identity?
So identity is absolutely crucial to everything around you, including your results. And obviously, as an entrepreneur, you're very focused on your results. And you should be looking there for both your identity as a person, as an individual, and also your identity in relation to your business, because how you see yourself, how you see your business is absolutely key to the results that you're going to get.
So, Lindsay, I know that you're a psychologist. You studied this for your PhD. You've done a lot of statistical research-based analysis on this topic, which obviously differentiates you from, for example, peak performance or mindset coaches out there, of which there are quite a lot. So, what exactly do you mean by identity, and how does it differ to mindset, for example?
So mindset is often talking about beliefs and emotions. Identity is your self-representation, the way that you see yourself, and that's made up of a lot of different aspects of yourself. So you're going much deeper and more encompassing there than the things that you believe or the way that you feel or the attitudes that you have. They're all things that come from your identity. So when I'm looking at identity, I'm talking about three different aspects of it. I'm talking about your identity as an individual, so the way that you see yourself, the traits that you think that you have. I'm talking about your relational identity, so the way that you define yourself in relation to other people. And I'm talking about your collective identity, so the way that you define yourself with the groups that you would say that you belong to. And then the identity is basically answering the question, who am I? And this was my big interest on my PhD. When you start looking at who am I, the things that you believe, the things that are important to you are all the ones that you've integrated into your self-concept. So there can be a lot of things that relate to your identity which aren't really important and don't make that much of a difference to you. The things that impact your results are the things that you think are important, which is why two people having much the same experience can have very, very different results, can have very, very different beliefs and emotional experiences.
Okay, so if I was to say, let's get tangible and give concrete examples of that, Lindsay, what would you say?
So you can have, so from an entrepreneurial example, you could take COVID now. You could have two people with very similar business experiences, very similar skill sets sitting in the middle of COVID. And one will look at it and see a challenge and see the potential for their business to fold. And one will look at it and see the potential for their business to pivot or take new direction or to seize new opportunity. And the results that these two people will get will differ hugely. The things that they could offer to their potential clients may be very much the same. So the people themselves will probably have a very different way of looking at themselves. If they came to me as an identity specialist, I would probably find they differed in their relations to the way they talked about themselves. They would have different views on their competence, on their potential, on their ability to be resilient. And this is where I find the biggest differences. It isn't around ability usually, it isn't around just the beliefs and emotions, it's around the views that people have of their individual selves.
Mm. What I find is that people in corporate life can sometimes hide. So it's very easy to bumble along, perhaps, depending on the level that you work at. But generally, corporate life is not as unforgiving in terms of, should we say, revenue streams as entrepreneurship, where basically, if you own a business and you are the business, you have to be working on your mindset in order just to get up in the morning and get those clients and build that business. So, I mean, I've been brought up with, or to say brought up, I mean, certainly I've done a lot of work myself over recent years on this issue of mindset. So, and a lot of entrepreneurs that I know also have. So basically, we tell ourselves that life is full of opportunities and that, well, we say all sorts of things, affirmations and positive thoughts and vibes and things like that. So I guess what I'm trying to kind of get at is all that stuff helps, but what you do goes deeper, doesn't it?
It does go deeper. So you'll have found yourself, no doubt, because I know that you do a lot of work around mindset and affirmation. You'll have no doubt found that if you're affirming something positive, if you have an underlying fundamental doubt that what you're saying is correct and it's not going to happen, that you can tell yourself that thing as much as you want and it isn't really making any change at a deeper level. And a lot of those things which push back against the affirmations are identity based, which is why I see such a lot of things around imposter syndrome, fear of failure, self sabotage. You're quite right in what you say. Obviously, I have an interesting take on the corporate entrepreneur split because I consulted into corporate for 14 years, but I was self employed.
Yes.
I spent a long time in the corporate world as an entrepreneur. So I had a foot in both camps, as it were. Entrepreneurs are much more receptive in general to the must be positive mindset. And as you say, they carry a greater burden. To a certain extent, you're insulated from the need to keep yourself positive and keep yourself striving, even at the higher levels in the corporate world, because to some extent the company will cushion you from the need for everything to be on you. If you're wearing the main hat and you're the person carrying the business forward, if you lose that self-belief, then the business will suffer from it. However good your team is, you're the leader, you're the person who has to carry it forward. And if you lose that, then the business will be impacted. So, yeah, absolutely, you're right.
So I think where this gets really interesting is on the topic of, well, call it a wealthy mindset, but those little decisions that we make from day to day. And I often catch myself doing this. I think, all right, now I've got to do something that is call it the income generating tasks that I know are going to really impact my success. And then I catch myself, it's like, oh God, I don't feel like doing that. And then I'll just have a little fiddle on social media or I'll do something that's a bit easier. And I'm sure that I'm not alone with that. We all have a tendency to procrastinate and shy away from the things that we find hard, but that are going to move the needle for us significantly, don't we?
We do. Procrastination is a really interesting one. So, obviously, in what I deal with procrastination a lot. One of the first things I do with everybody I work with, no matter what the problem is that they bring to me, is find out if it is identity based, because quite often it is, and sometimes it isn't. So, with procrastination, sometimes it's because we don't know what to do, or we don't know if it's going to have an effect, or just because, as you say, it's a mind numbingly awful task that we really don't want to do ourselves. And it's much more fun to say, jump on social media for an hour. But I mean, if you think about it from a logical point of view, if you're going to do something and you think it won't work, or you don't know how to do it, that's going to cause doubt around your confidence in your ability. And when you're an entrepreneur, you wear a lot of hats. If you're in a business, generally, you're wearing a lot more hats than you would be in a job. In a job, you have a nice job description and you do your job and somebody else is doing their job. And if it's out with your job remit, you go to the person whose job that is, and they do that bit. So when you're an entrepreneur, maybe you've got to go and do your marketing or your sales or some financial stuff, and that's not what you do. So I do psychology, but obviously as an entrepreneur, I have to do other things. And I think that's very common. Sometimes, when people come to me with procrastination, it's purely because they don't know how to do what they're doing, or they're not clear, and it makes them feel bad doing it because, in what they're good at, they are an expert. And when they're doing what they're expert at, it makes them feel great because they're very, very competent at it. And then they go and do this other thing, and it doesn't make them feel good because they're not competent at it. It's not their core skill set. But then you get the procrastination around what's going to happen if I fail, and then you have the underlying beliefs coming out around identity, and you get the procrastination that comes from, well, I'm not that competent a person, I'm not a success. And a lot of that is embedded usually in earlier experiences, sometimes childhood experiences, sometimes previous things that have happened in business. And a lot of the identity stuff, the problem with that is we don't actually remember the thing that happened that made us believe what we believe and have these thoughts around our identity on it. So it can be quite challenging to fish those out and realize where that procrastination is coming from.
That's so interesting. And just to go back to the distinction between corporate life and entrepreneurship, I think we've talked about corporate life in relatively rosy terms, I think, up until now in the interview. But certainly what goes along with corporate life, I think, for a lot of people is a real sense of powerlessness, and also not being able to choose the people who you're spending your time with. And I mean, certainly for me, that is a very, very significant advantage of entrepreneurship, in that I can actually choose my partners and I can choose how to spend my time, and I'm not answerable to anybody. Do you find that the people that you work with struggle with the transition in terms of their identity from, say, a corporate role to entrepreneurship, if they are moving from one to the other?
Hugely. And going back as well, because I know people who've gone back into corporate from being an entrepreneur. I think it's difficult both ways. And a lot of this is around the collective identity part. So as I said earlier, identity is complex, it's individual, and it's relational, and it's collective. And if part of your collective identity is I'm an executive or an engineer or whatever within a company, you have a certain defined role. You know who you are in relation to that job role. And it's very clear to you. And all of a sudden, you come out and you're an entrepreneur and you have this big challenge that it's all upon you, and you lose that clear definition. But the downside, as you've said, when you're an entrepreneur, you define your business. So one of the things I talk to people about, and I see entrepreneurs struggling with, is a mismatch between their personal identity and their business's identity, which clearly causes issues. When you're in corporate, you kind of have to live with your business's identity unless you're very, very senior within it. So you have to deal with the people around you. You have to deal with the business identity around you. You have to deal with whatever manager you get given. And to a certain extent, you have to be whatever the person within that company who you're reporting to, and whatever the C-suite thinks the person doing your job in that company looks like. So they have an idea of, say, what an HR person or an accountant in that company looks like and what their identity should be like, and you're constrained by that, and that can be difficult. And that's why sometimes someone's face doesn't fit within the company. They can be absolutely exceptional at their job, but nevertheless they don't fit within the company, and then they feel obliged to move because it just doesn't work.
Mm. Isn't it often just like fitting a square peg into a round hole? I know that there were times when I certainly felt like that, and I think that's very common.
I felt like that. I think I'm fairly flexible, and I have felt like that. And I've seen other people within companies struggling because I mentored quite heavily. That's how I got interested in psychology. I didn't start off in psychology, but I started off in tech, and then I got into management, and then I mentored in management. So I mentored people over well over a decade. And I saw that a lot. And I saw people also moving between teams, moving between companies, and maybe thriving in the same job in a different team or a different company where they'd struggled elsewhere. So, yeah, I think it's very common.
Is it to do with values? Because I know that values are very important, and sometimes I interview entrepreneurs. For example, I interviewed the founder of Barefoot Wines, which is the biggest wine brand in the world, a couple of weeks ago. And their culture is very, very, very strong. And they started off almost as hippies. And so they had a lovely, lovely culture and set of values. And people stayed with them for a very long time because they really aligned with the company. And I know other businesses, and I'm not going to mention names here because, they've got some family connections, shall we say,
Yeah.
who are very, very hard driving and very uncaring, I'd say. Of course, those businesses, they're not going to have loyal or happy employees, really, are they?
No, and one of the things that I always found strange because I used to teach management and leadership. One of the things I always found very strange was that people couldn't see that if you don't get buy-in from your staff and you don't build that team identity and you don't get values to get the staff to come in and share, and you don't value your team, then how do you expect people to be happy? And if your focus is productivity and bottom line, then it's so simple to engage your staff and to build that sort of culture with, just a bit of thought and a bit of care. And the amount of waste of good team resources that I've seen happen across various companies through lack of doing that is unbelievable. So yeah, a lot of it is values. A lot of it is not building the business identity, the team identity, bringing people on board with it. People need to feel valued. I hear people say about, and I think I said this in my TEDx, that they say, oh, it's all about money. It's nothing to do with money really, beyond the point where people feel that they're being paid a reasonable salary for what they do. It's just a hygiene factor. People need to be satisfied with their work and they need to feel valued. And if you can achieve that for your staff and they can enjoy what they're doing and think that you appreciate them, they'll stay with you and they'll work harder and you'll make more profit and they'll be more productive. And the number of managers that don't do that in corporate is frankly frightening.
I mean, it's also, I think, about the mission and the vision of the company, and not in a cynical way, but of course it does come. The culture of a company does come from the top, and the more seniority you have, the higher up you are in the value chain, the more your values are going to be transmitted throughout the company. So I think what happens is a lot of the time people who run businesses who have got themselves into a very senior position, or even, in, as you said, C-suite or whatever, their values are more to do with achievement and power, as opposed to collaboration and support and all of those softer skills that will make people feel valued. So is there just an inherent problem there?
I think there is a fairly inherent problem. I did some interesting stuff around gender and leadership a while ago. There's a perception still in a lot of companies that leadership looks like toughness. And clearly, there is an element of leadership that requires assertiveness. There's an element of leadership that requires you to lead and to be very clear on what you're leading. But collaboration, communication, all those other skills, they're all needed as well. So I think you have to change the perception of what good leadership looks like. And it doesn't look like someone waving their arms and telling everyone what to do. It looks like bringing everyone on board with it and helping people to understand this is what we're trying to achieve. This is your role in trying to achieve it. Let's all understand that we're in it together, you know. And if you approach leadership like that, you can bring on everyone in the company, and really everyone in the company should be on board with it.
So do you think on the whole leaders can be trained and leadership is a trainable skill, or do you think that some people are very resistant to leadership in that form?
I think some people have traits which makes them more natural leaders, but I have always said that you can train leadership, and I've trained leadership. I've trained people to lead who've said I am not a leader. Often it's more of a problem when people already think they're a leader and they're not doing it very well, because they don't want to listen to why they might not be doing it very well. But certainly, I do think leadership's trainable. I don't subscribe to this leaders are born and not made thing. You can teach leadership skills as you can teach any other skills. But like any skill, some people will find it easier than other people.
Mm. Because you're a psychologist, Lindsay, I'm interested to talk about the impact of your childhood experience on identity and your results as an entrepreneur. And I'm somebody who's had quite a lot of success in my life, and I think I had a very difficult start, and I think for me that's been one of the things that has propelled me on. And whenever I've thought about giving up, I've just remembered being back in that place. Those memories come back, and I think, you know what, I never want to go back to that place of feeling as powerless as I did when I was a child. So some people would think, well, you've had a difficult childhood, and so therefore you're going to have you're not going to be successful in life, and you're just going to be haunted with all those memories and just be a dysfunctional person. And I guess what I'm interested to explore, because I know this isn't just me. I mean, there are many people, entrepreneurs, who've had very, very difficult childhoods and gone on to have extraordinarily successful businesses. What is it that makes a difference between somebody that's had a difficult childhood and goes on to become very successful, and somebody who's had a very similar childhood, maybe a sibling in the same family, and goes on to be what most people would call a loser or a very dysfunctional person?
This is something that I'm hugely passionate about, and it's why I do my pro bono work that I do. So I also had a very difficult childhood, and that's what started my interest in identity. I had lots of bereavements. I didn't know my dad. My dad left home before I was born. I left home essentially when I was 14. I had a very turbulent life up until I was 25. And
Wow.
when I was 25, I said, right, I have nothing. And I literally had nothing. I had a bag of clothes, a bag of books, and a very elderly Chevy Camaro, and that was it. And I said, right, I'm going to change how I see myself, because I see myself as a victim, and I see myself as somebody who's very hard done by, and life's done all these awful things to me, and all these people have done all these awful things to me. And, you know, look at me feeling sorry for myself, and I've got this huge chip on my shoulder. And I thought, so I can carry on putting myself in this. Well, you know, if people hadn't done this stuff to me, then I wouldn't be in this position. Or I can say, no, I own my own life. Look at all the good things about me. Look at all this capability that I have. Look at all my traits and talents. And I'm going to see myself differently. I'm going to look at all the things that I have achieved, because I had achieved stuff. I'd managed to survive to 25, which was quite good.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do something different. And, you know, 2 years later, I'd got a good career. 4 years later, I was in management. 5 years later, I was in consulting. Did a lot of money in consulting. And then when I started mentoring people, people were saying to me, how did you get from where you were, you know, sort of in 5 years to being a really well paid consultant? And I had no clue, Jane, because psychology wasn't something I'd ever done. And I literally had picked myself up and done it. And then when I started mentoring other people, because I'd had no sort of formal training, but I was now a leader and I felt I should lead people, when people came to me with their issues, because I was one of those people that people would say, oh, I can talk to you. And I'm like, okay. So I helped them in the way that I'd helped myself, and it worked. So then I did my psychology degree because I was interested as to why it worked. And then when I finished my psychology degree, I still had questions I couldn't answer. So I started my PhD, which I'm now halfway through, and I'm still learning all the time. But yeah, identity to me is the answer. The way that you see yourself and the way that you feel other people see you, and they're both important, is absolutely fundamental to the results that you get, the things that you believe, the way that you respond to things that happen to you, and the things that you will try to do. So if you see yourself in a very negative way, if you think other people see you in a very negative way, then you will feel bad about things that happen. You will have negative beliefs. You will have very low attitude to things, and you will not try and change circumstances as you would if you said, no, hang on a minute, this stuff's external and it's happened, but it's not changing who I am. This is who I am, and I can control that. And I will go out and I will do these things. And this is what I need to do to get where I want to be and to be who I want to be. And that's the essence of what started my interest in identity. So the research grew from that, and all my coaching work grew from that. And it's what I mentored and saw that it worked. So all good psychologists start with their own start with their own stuff, I think.
Of course, of course. Now, in my experience, when I look back at my life, there have been certain defining incidents that have put me on a different course, shall we say, and actually given me extra learnings that have, although they might have been painful, they've been very valuable. So I'm just interested. You talked about that time from the age of 14 until 25. I mean, that's more than 10 years, right? So what was it in those 10 years that led up to that event, shall we say, when you decided that enough is enough?
I had defined myself as a rebel, and I was rebelling against the world. So I lost the opportunity to go to university. I'd been very bright and done very well at school. So I lost the opportunity to go to university because I had no support to go to university. I had the opportunity to do various jobs, and I probably could have progressed in a career. But as I think I've mentioned on my social media a few times, I was the queen of self-sabotage, which interestingly is one of the things I coach now. Yeah, whenever I started doing well at anything, I'd immediately self-sabotage it before it could get to where it ought to have been. And then when I was 25, I had quite a nasty relationship breakup. The relationship was terrible anyway, but the breakup was awful. And I suddenly thought, all these things that I'm blaming on my past and external stuff, I'm actually causing more damage to myself now going forward than anything that's happened to me. And now it's me doing it. I'm blaming everything that happened, and it's actually me. And I sat down and put myself under a microscope and looked at how I saw myself. And it was the way that I was looking at myself in relation to the world that was causing me to do all these things. And then I went back to how I used to see myself before I was 14 and thought, how did we get from there to here? What are the things that have happened that have made you believe all this stuff and see yourself in this way? And, none of them were that fundamental. They were all just external things. They were things that had happened to me. They were things that people had said. And I didn't have to take those opinions, and the people who'd said them didn't necessarily have my welfare at heart. And I just decided, this is me to make this choice now. And it was a self-defining moment. So one of the things I look at in my PhD, ironically, is self-defining memories, which you've just talked about. And they are the memories that you would describe to another person if they said, tell me about a moment that you found really defining in your life that changed a path. And that's one of the things that I actually study, because they're really important, the things that happen to us that change the way that we think about ourselves.
Mm. I mean, I did some work on storytelling and brand, and I actually did some study with a guy called Ted McGrath in the US, and he's all about story. His thing is you connect to people through stories. So you tell your story, and in fact, he's gone all the way. He's made a one-man play that he's actually going to be turning into a feature film. So he's in LA and he's very much into that kind of that scene. But his play is called Good Enough, and it's all about the highs and the lows of his life and about those defining moments. It's really, really good play. And I'm just interested to explore whether, because we had to write our own story. And so I obviously have my version of the ups and the downs that I can tell. If we're struggling in life, whether we need to go back and actually look at those defining moments and actually interpret them differently.
So that's absolutely what I do with people. I work with autobiographical memory and narrative self. We work like that. We tell ourselves a story. I work a lot with narrative psychology. So as you're going along, you're constructing a story about yourself, and that's how we process the things that happen to ourselves, and that's how we process our place in the world and who we think that we are. And if we've written a story in a particular way and the events that happen in it in a particular way, and we have objects that happen to us that we have in our lives. So an object can be anything from a person to a job role to, a particular item that we own that's very, very important in how we define ourselves. These things all come along and they all come into the narrative, and they all change the way that we interpret our identity. A narrative identity is always changing anyway. It never stays static, or it really shouldn't stay static. So yeah, absolutely. I think that approach that he's taking is excellent. If you look at narrative self and you're talking about yourself in a very negative way, then it will have a huge impact on the beliefs, the emotions, the attitudes, the behaviors. So when people come to me and they tell me about, I have an issue with imposter syndrome, I have an issue with procrastination, and we have our initial meeting and I work out that it is an identity-based problem, then I'm talking with them about the story that they're telling themselves and where that might be coming from, essentially. And that's what we change. We change the way that they're interpreting their own story.
That's really interesting. And of course, the other thing that is very common amongst entrepreneurs is that we don't always have the best personal relationships because entrepreneurs notoriously drive themselves quite hard. And so I speak to quite a lot of people week in, week out, and I know that sometimes there is some relationship strife, or entrepreneurs have some difficult people at times that come into their lives, and that was certainly my experience. I've been with a couple of partners that were actually the fathers of my children, who were both exceptionally challenging and difficult people, and obviously I chose them. But what would you say in terms of the impact on other people is the purpose of going through this identity process? Are you going to be able to change other people?
So you're not changing other people so much as you're changing the power that other people have over you. So going back to identity being individual and relational and collective, I never I never tell people to change anyone else, but if you look at the relational side of that, if you become very clear on who you are, it makes you much less susceptible to people being able to manipulate you, to people being
Mm,
able to take advantage of you. Because I find if people see that they can do it, quite often they will. I also find that a lot of entrepreneurs tend to attract people that are quite manipulative.
definitely.
So I'm not a relationship coach. I don't specialize in that. But from speaking to a lot of entrepreneurs either have the issue around manipulative relationships or have the issue around they're so tied up with their business that they're struggling with putting the time into the relationship. Then they're struggling on that side because they feel so driven to be putting everything into the business. And that's the two biggest relational problems I hear from entrepreneurs. So yeah, I would say it helps to be very clear about you, what you want in a relationship, what you can give to a relationship, and also, because we define ourselves by relationships, if you're in a relationship where the power is all with someone else, or you're quite disengaged from it, or in some way the relationship's not working, it can have quite a negative impact on your identity as well.
I mean, I certainly know that for myself, I will never, ever, ever go back to the kind of relationship that I had before. And looking back, I actually know that there were certain times in my life I can trace back my history and say, you know what, at that particular time, I was particularly vulnerable. I was particularly exposed because it was a time of change and I didn't have the support in my life at that time. And that was what opened the chink to let these people in. And I'm very, very aware of that now. And as I said, I will never find myself in that situation again because I personally have done a lot of work around that. But it's interesting because I do think that if I had had somebody who had your wisdom and insight around at that particular time, I wouldn't have gone down those particular rabbit holes that I did. And those are relationships in business and in life, by the way.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. The same can be true for business partners. And I think it's very important from an identity basis to build yourself up against that, because a lot of us aren't clear about who we are. And I think also from a social support angle, and there's reams and reams of psychology to show that social support is important. Entrepreneurs are often by themselves. So
Yes.
by the nature of what they do, we spend a lot of time by ourselves, whether it's physically by ourselves or mentally and emotionally by ourselves, because we're in charge and we're working on something all alone, and we're shut in our own heads doing our stuff. And that does leave you exposed to that. There's so much psychology saying, social support is really, really vital. And entrepreneurs get less of that than the majority of people do. So I think it's very important for entrepreneurs to be clear on identity, because otherwise, yes, it does let people come along and take advantage if you're not clear about who and what you are.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And connection is something that I am, of course, extremely passionate about. And I learnt myself that it's like a daily habit, it's like exercise or brushing my teeth, that I have to say to myself, right, how am I going to connect authentically? I mean, obviously, that sounds like a bit of a cliche, but who am I going to be able to connect with who I trust and who I can tell the truth to and who's going to tell the truth to me. And I can actually have that exchange
Yeah.
every day. And for me, it is something that I choose consciously to build into my life every single day. I find people within my circle who I can have those conversations and those connections with. And that is one of my greatest defenses against being vulnerable, to users. It really is.
I think that's a great thing to do anyway, because that's part of your relational identity, to have those relationships around you, and it puts you in groups as well. So there's your collective identity, you're interacting with people that you have genuine connection with. And
Hmm.
no, you're like me, I think. You like people.
Yes.
And it's good to have that relationship with people especially who understand you, who understand what you're trying to do. You have, common sympathies, common goals, and you're all interested in what each other is doing, and you can be glad for each other in your successes. And that's something that you miss when you come out of corporate, because you used to have that team around you and everyone was rooting for the same goal, hopefully. And now you may have lost that, but I think in building up those relationships in the entrepreneur world, it replaces something which is really valuable.
Mm. I mean, personally, when I was in corporate, I was very lonely. It was a very difficult time because I was always the boss and I didn't have a supportive team around me. What I noticed is that the people who were effectively the employees who were getting paid a relatively low salary, they were the ones that had that team support. I was always, always the boss and I was always by myself and I was in a much more competitive kind of backstabbing place where, being on the board, of course, then it was all about the money. There was a lot of crazy behavior and at that particular time, and obviously that industry, it's media in London, can be pretty cutthroat and backstabby. So for me, I don't miss those relationships one bit. And I know that people like Nick Bradley, for example, who I also interviewed for my podcast. He worked in, private equity, and he worked corporately at a very high level as well. And I think generally the higher you get, the less comfort you get from the people around you and the more stress and aggravation. So I'm very happy not to have that anymore.
I would agree with you. I went consultant for a reason, and I always said that the only way I would ever accept a board position was if it was my company. For that reason, I lurked about, usually interacting with the directors and interacting with the board, but not being on it. I was a consultant, and I got to build teams. So, project program teams that delivered certain goals, and I got to act like one of the team, even though I was managing it. And periodically, people would say, "You're really a manager." Do you know, one of the most defining moments for me as a manager was when the security guard on the desk at a very, very big company that I work for asked me one morning, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Yeah, sure you can. What?" And he said, "Are you really a manager? Someone told me you're a manager." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I can't believe you're a manager." And I thought, why? Am I really unprofessional or something? And I said, yeah, why? And he said, "You speak to me every morning. You know my name." I thought, yeah.
Oh,
And he said, "The rest of them only speak to me when they want me to call a taxi."
oh.
And I don't think we should ever have that attitude in any company.
No, no, and I certainly know people who do run companies, and they are extremely polite and caring to people who are just sitting on the desk, and you have security guards and people like that, than as to everybody else, because really everybody should be treated with dignity, shouldn't they, and
Absolutely.
consideration.
See, to me, everybody is part of the company, from the cleaners and the security guards up to the CEO. Everyone is part of that company delivering it. If someone is employed by the company needs them, and they're there with a role in it, and they should all be brought on board with the company.
Mm. So, something that I'd like to go into some depth with you on as well, Lindsay, is really parenting and children, because a lot of us are parents, and it's very, very difficult, I think, to take control of the formation of our children's identities. And something that I've noticed, I've got three girls, and there's so much pressure on children, particularly at the moment with COVID-19. It's a very, very difficult time to be a young person. How can we help our children to be more resilient and to form a good identity for themselves without being overly controlling or being a helicopter parent?
Really good question. And that's something that I don't think I got right. And this is way before my psychology days. I get it much better now, but now I've got a psychology degree and my daughter's a lot older. I was always a worried parent, not too bad helicopter wise, but wanted to make sure she didn't make the mistakes that I made. So one lesson that I learned myself is they need to make their own mistakes, but you can be approachable. You have to be approachable and you have to be open, but you have to let them express themselves. So I mean, kids' identity starts forming pretty early. By the time they're 4 or 5, you will start to see an identity forming pretty clearly, and the narrative will be forming pretty clearly. So let them learn, let them explore, but be very clear with them when you're telling them something. I mean, you can't reason with a child of a small age like you can with a teenager. Some would dispute that you can reason with a teenager, but I think you can. I think you have to let them know that they are their own person. They're not an extension of you, but you also have to let them know that you have information that you can give them, be there to provide it for them. I mean, my daughter's 22 now, and we literally talk to each other about everything. We're very, very close. But she is very much her own person. She's in no way a mini me, and she does what suits her. But reinforce them as well. If they want to do something, if they want to be something. I see kids, the thing that I did wrong, I feel, when she was younger, was I encouraged her to do things that I thought would be a good career, or that would stand her in good stead at school. And, it wasn't necessarily her. I think we have to try and have confidence in them, to be themselves and support them to be themselves, but just be wary of where we need to step in and maybe give good advice. Because I think we're parents, we want to do the best for our kids. And if we see them doing something that we think is, wrong or going the wrong path, there's this urge to jump in. But if we don't let them explore and push their boundaries a bit, then they don't learn.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I think it's very easy a lot of parents end up wrapping their children in cotton wool and trying to save them from pain by actually taking all the strain for them. And in fact, that sets them up for failure later on, because they have to learn these lessons along the way, don't they? Just as we all do.
It doesn't teach resilience. So if they learn resilience when they're younger, I remember going through this, so all the kids win, and I'm thinking it would be lovely if all through life all the kids won, but all the kids don't win all through life. So if we don't let them experience things that make them build up resilience when they're younger, when they have us about to support them, then they're going to have to learn resilience when they're older, and we're not necessarily there or immediately on hand for them, and when the impact's greater. So I'm a supporter of, don't always be there for your kids, always be there to support them, but don't give them a false sense of, nothing will ever go wrong, because unfortunately the world isn't like that.
Yes, that's right. Well, Lindsay, it's been absolutely wonderful to interview you. What an interesting topic, identity. And I'm sure that our listeners will have really enjoyed the conversation between us. So I just wanted to thank you for joining us today, and to ask you, have people wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
My website is agamegroup.com, and my email address is lindsay@agamegroup.com. So do feel free to get in touch.
Well, thank you very much again, Lindsay, and see you soon.
Thank you, Jane. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Smart Connector podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not head over to janebaylor.com and order a copy of my free report on building your personal brand. I'd love to connect with you on social media. And finally, don't forget to like and subscribe to my podcast so that you never miss a show. Thanks for listening in, and see you soon.